Welcome to Stories to Watch 2023, World Resources Institute's flagship event, where we will look ahead to the stories, people, and ideas that will shape 2023 and beyond. I'm Lauren Zellen, Director of Communications to the President and CEO. We're so glad you've joined us today. Last year, WRI celebrated 40 years of offering solutions to the world's most pressing environment and development challenges. Today, you will hear what to watch for in the year ahead from WRI President and CEO Ani Dasgupta. Then we will take your questions with a panel of WRI's experts. Please enter your questions in the Q&A box throughout the presentation. With that, enjoy the show.
Hello, welcome to 2023 Stories to Watch. If you've been here before, welcome back. If this is your first time, we're very happy you're here. My name is Ani Dasgupta. I'm the President and CEO of WRI, World Resources Institute. WRI is a global research organization with about 2,000 staff that are working to solve the world's greatest challenges. Every year around this time, we gather all our staff and ask the question what the next year will look like. What stories will be the most defining stories of next year? What I present to you is our collective wisdom. We think decisions made in 2022 will really shape this year and years to come. So before we jump into the stories to watch, we need to revisit this year quickly. We're entering the fourth year of the pandemic. The economic destruction, pain to families continues across the world. Then there was inflation, the fear of inflation. The year ended with 9% inflation, causing troubles in every economy in the world. And then in February, Russia attacked Ukraine. The tragedy in Ukraine and Ukrainian people continues. And impacted Ukraine, impacted Europe. But something else also happened. A stronger Europe has emerged from the process, a resurgence of NATO. But most importantly, what this tragedy revealed, the interconnectedness of the global crisis. For example, the energy crisis that happened in Europe became a global crisis. 70 million people globally at risk for losing electricity this year. Food was already getting pricier early in this year, but it became a breaking point for food crisis, simply because Russia and Ukraine supply over a quarter of global wheat. Global food prices surged by more than 14% in 2022. And climate impacts continued. It remained a threat multiplier across the world. The climate impact in 2022 was worse than the year before. Vulnerable people got more impacted than ever before. Take the example of Pakistan. The floods in Pakistan got 33 million people displaced. It wasn't just a humanitarian disaster, an economic disaster that reduced the GDP growth of Pakistan from 5 to 2%. And after many decades of progress in poverty reduction, because of the pandemic in the last few years, we saw poverty actually increasing for the first time in decades. And this year, because of the invasion, 95 million more people were pushed into poverty. So this year was a really difficult year. But it wasn't all bad. We think there were 4 major breakthroughs that took place last year that will shape the year to come. Decisions made by leaders and people will actually shape not only the year 2023, but years to come. First of them was, in spite of these disruption, economic and otherwise, that I talked about, global renewable energy deployment broke records. There was 8% more global renewable energy this year than the year before. And this may not be fast enough, but this transition to renewable energy or green energy continues in spite of all the crises we saw. The second breakthrough was in Montreal in December, the Biodiversity Conference. The global leaders came together and made a new commitment, a more ambitious commitment to protect 30% of the world's land and water and reverse biodiversity loss. In Montreal, I saw for the first time the most business people in a biodiversity conference. This is because this real understanding of how nature and economy works. $44 trillion of global economic output, $80 trillion, is connected to nature. We think this is a turning point of how nature works, understanding how nature and the economy. The third breakthrough came earlier in the year, in the COP27 in Egypt. After 30 years of discussion, leaders of the world agreed to set up a loss and damage fund. Loss and damage fund funds climate-related losses that are not possible to recover from or adapt to. The reason this is a symbolic and important breakthrough is because for many years, vulnerable and poorer countries have said they need to receive these funds from richer countries because they did not cause this problem. This is a symbolic and a tip of the iceberg of the bigger problem of how to fund just transition in all countries. The last breakthrough came in two parts, in two opposite parts of the world. In Indonesia, there was agreement of just energy transition, JETP it's called, by a group of rich countries supporting Indonesia for their transition. $20 billion, unprecedented amount of funds for Indonesia's transition. On the other side of the globe, in the United States, the world's largest economy, took a very ambitious approach to shift the whole economy to 3 climate-related legislation. So real question for us then, will these breakthroughs remain individual breakthroughs, or they will become a beginning of systemic shift that the world needs? That they will come together to change to a more sustainable, more equitable economy and move away from incremental change to system-wide change. All the 4 stories we'll talk about actually dwells on this central question. Would we see systemic shifts that the world needs, or they will be just incremental breakthroughs? Now, let's go to our first story. Our first story is about the energy crisis. How will the conflict in Ukraine and the energy crisis in Europe impact Europe? But not only that, how will it impact the world? The Russian invasion of Ukraine was absolute weaponization of energy by Russia. Europe was dependent on Russia for 40% of its energy sources, and it was just literally stopped. As you can imagine, that impacted the whole society, across the whole economy. The price of energy went up 41%, impacting households, businesses across the economy. The energy prices raised cost of living in Europe by 7%. Millions of people fear their home won't be heated this winter. So as you can imagine, with this crisis in front of them, European leaders took drastic action. The first thing they did, very wisely, is focus on reducing the demand for gas. The second thing they did is that they tried to figure out existing coal-fired plants could be brought back online, or even sometimes expanded the life of nuclear plants. But mostly what they focused on is to find alternative source of LNG, or liquefied natural gas, from other parts of the world. They were actually quite successful. As you can see from the chart behind me, the yellow line is Russian gas, and the blue line is the alternative sources European leaders have already secured from across the world, mostly from US, Qatar, and Nigeria. This is actually very good news. At the same time, there is a concern about this large dependence and the new investment in natural gas. Is this a natural gas trap? Would it build future overcapacity in Europe? Would it create path dependency of fossil fuel? Because the infrastructure is built, they will keep using it, and will it slow down Europe's path towards 1.5 degree or net zero by 2050? This is why Europe finds itself at a crossroads. Because natural gas, in any models that's been done to get to 1.5 degree, emissions has to steadily go down. The green line actually paints that picture. But as you can see, the investment that's been already planned and the investment that's been proposed, because of the crisis, if we invested all this to build natural gas infrastructure, we will not, and Europe will not, reach 1.5 degree. That is the crossroad they face. Actually, some other people, experts across the world, feel the opposite might happen. That this crisis will actually encourage and push leaders towards greening their energy system faster, not only in Europe, but across the world. This is Fatih Birol behind me, who is the head of IEA, the International Energy Agency. One of the prominent leaders in the field, very credible. He believes that. So the question in front of us, really, if Fatih is right, will the crisis in Europe spur global shift to a low-carbon energy future? And if Fatih is right, what are the things we should be watching for? Obviously, the first thing we watch for, what happens in Europe? What will European leaders do or continue to do? Well, the good news of this crisis, if there is any, is actually it has brought European leaders closer together. Europe's energy policy is more coherent than ever and more ambitious than ever. Europe actually has been increasing its ambition in renewable energy over the years, actually since last 10 years. But this year, because of the crisis, a new program, REPowerEU, was put together that raised the ambitions of 2030 targets, renewable energy, from 40% to 45%. It doubled its solar capacity. Its investments are $224 billion in renewable energy that targets an efficiency, and actually VP Timmermans pointed out that it's going to increase its target from 55% reduction to 57% reduction by 2030. So in Europe, they're actually taking this opportunity to increase its ambition and not reduce it. So will this resolve, will this unity in Europe towards the energy policy, towards working together, continue? That is really a key thing to watch for. This kind of a transition, this kind of ambition and energy transition cannot happen without consumers being centrally part of it, with consumers actively reducing their energy demand. That's where heat pump will play a very important role. It's already playing a very important role. Heat pumps together, if deployed, can reduce 500 million tons of emission by 2030. This is the annual CO2 emission of all cars in Europe. Heat pumps not only can reduce emissions and need for energy, but also can create jobs in Europe. So a lot to look for. Will consumers be part of this revolution that has been unleashed by European leaders? This partnership with citizens and leaders is critical for this energy transition in Europe, anywhere else, and everywhere else in the world. In Europe, we see voters actually supporting the change. 83% of people in the EU think that Russia's invasion makes it more urgent to invest in renewable energy, to be much more energy independent. Other countries, I'm sure, is watching it will happen in their countries or not. This policy shifts and ambition in Europe, of course, impacts and will impact the rest of the world. It already is. What the long-term impact is, it's unclear. But right now, as you can imagine, as Europe is trying to buy LNG from all over the world, that is creating a scarcity and rising prices. So every country in the world who depends on LNG is trying to secure its source. Africa, China, India, all of them are. As they keep securing their source of LNG, they're also doing, like for example, India, investment in renewable energy. To meet India's goal of 500 gigawatts by 2030, India has to invest 25 gigawatts every year. China, who is already a renewable energy leader, continues to invest on renewable energy. So right now, we see a world where countries are investing in both renewable energy to secure energy independence, but also securing sources of fossil fuel so they don't get left out. It's unclear where we will go, but the movements from the investments in Europe is already having implication among leaders across the world. So the question for us is, this crisis and the way European policy is reacting to it, will this not only green European energy sources, or would it be an actual inflection point for the whole world, for a systemic shift? Because Europe is a very important and large economy towards making greener energy or more renewable energy the norm from the world. That is the story to watch for. Our next story is about tropical forests. More importantly, will the new leadership, especially in Brazil, help forests rebound? There is understandable excitement in the world for President Lula's election. President Lula promised, before he got elected, zero deforestation. Brazil is responsible for 40% of tropical primary forest loss. When President Lula arrived, even before he became president, at the COP in Egypt, it was actual stir. Getting a ticket to the auditorium where he spoke was the hardest ticket to get in all of 2 weeks. Some of our team members did manage to get a ticket. I didn't. President Lula made a lot of progress in his first term in office, hence the excitement. He was able to reduce deforestation to 2-decade low. As you can see from the chart behind me, as soon as he left office, this number actually kept going up. During President Bolsonaro's time, it was a 14-year high. President Lula, during his election campaign, set a very important and extensive agenda for deforestation and for the environment. And in his first days in office, he started keeping the promise. He appointed Marina Silva, Minister of Environment, who was already part of his last cabinet and a very well-known expert on the topic. He created the first Indigenous Peoples Ministry, appointed Sonia Guajajara, a known indigenous leader, to that ministry. He opened up the Amazon Fund to see if international capital can start flowing to the Amazon. The Amazon is not just Brazil. It's 9 countries from the Amazon basin. It's 6.8 million kilometers, the size of the continental United States. Many countries actually have new leadership. For example, Colombia has President Petro, who also has put together an ambitious plan to reverse deforestation. But Amazon basin is part of a 3-basin system of remaining tropical forest in the world. 80% of terrestrial species live in this forest, which takes only 6-7% of land in the world. Yet, this forest system provides 23% of cost-effective climate mitigation, hence its importance to us, all of us. Yet, we have not been able to protect it. Actually, the chart behind me, the magenta dots on the chart, comes from our own GFW, or Global Forest Watch tool, that shows last 20 years destruction of the tropical forest. If you just focus on Amazon, the Amazon itself has lost 18% of its original forest cover. Scientists believe that if this 18% becomes 20 or 25%, that'll be actually collapse the Amazon forest system and start looking like savanna. Not the whole thing at a time, but parts at a time. This collapse of the forest is not just important for the forest itself, for trees. 47 million people live and make a living in the Amazon basin. 10% of the world's biodiversity lives in that forest. Up to 140 billion metric tons of carbon is stored in this forest. This is a story not just about trees. It's a story of people, their livelihood, and the economy beyond just the Amazon. Hundreds of cities are in the Amazon basin. The agricultural economy of Brazil, its most important export, is dependent on the rainfall on the Amazon forest. So we need a shift not just to protect the forest, we need a shift in approach of how we think about forests and its people and the economy around it. Because this is not a problem of conserving forests. This is a development problem that we need to solve, not only in the Amazon, but all tropical forests. So the question in front of us, will President Lula's return to lead Brazil will lead to a transformation in the way we manage forests and protect tropical forests, not only in Brazil, but for the rest of the world? Will we make standing forests more valuable for people who live there than grazing pasture and destroyed forest? What do we need to watch for this to happen? The first, obviously, we need to watch for what is going to happen in Brazil. Though President Lula got elected, he faces serious opposition, both in the legislature and among governors. 14 governors are actually in the opposition party, 11 are in support of him. And just recently, you've all seen, there was an attack of democratic institutions by people in Brasilia. I just want to say, us, people in WRI, are very much with people in Brazil and in support of democratic institutions in Brazil. Second, President Lula has to figure out how to enforce existing law. 98% of deforested Brazil are illegal. And finally, much more funds are required to protect the forest and create new livelihood for people there. What are the drivers of change that are outside Brazil? They're mostly related to commodities that is produced in Brazil and bought somewhere else. So regulations in other countries are very important. For example, you put together regulation to deforestation-free supply chain. Will such regulation take hold and go to, and other countries have the same regulation? Similarly, carbon markets can play a very important role. The question really is, will we see high-quality carbon markets that not only protects, but provides the benefits to the right people in these forests? Would we also see international finance flowing to the Amazon forest? UN estimates that the natural capital investment on natural capital, on nature-based solutions, needs to triple till 2030. Would we see similar reform take place in other tropical forests? For example, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, in the Congo Basin region, both DRC and Gabon faces election next year. In DRC, new permits for oil and gas are on the table. Will that remain during the election season, or will it change? President Macron of France and President Gabon is planning a One Forest Summit in the next 2 months to highlight the importance of innovation and innovative financing for protecting forests and for deforestation. And the last tropical forest in Indonesia, which has been really a champion in the last few years, Indonesia has managed reduce deforestation. They have created a moratorium in converting primary forests to peatlands. Indonesia also faces election next year. Would this momentum in Indonesia take hold? And would all these three countries that came together in G20 summit in Indonesia to form a rainforest alliance of these three countries, will that take root? So the big question that we're really watching for, that we actually been working on deforestation for a long time. Deforestation, the problem has been well known, yet we actually haven't made a dent. Will this leadership shift in Brazil, the excitement that has come with it, will it change the path forward in Brazil and the rest of the world to not only reverse deforestation, but to create a new approach for the regions where these forests are, not only for the trees, but for the people who live there? Our next story is about financing the transition. More specifically, will reforms in 2023 unlock the funding needed, much needed, for developing countries? Before I jump into the story, I do want to make sure you and I are on the same page on the word transition. I'm talking about the whole economy transition. How do we go from where we are to an economy that's low carbon, good for nature, good for people? That transition requires financing. The bad news is the funding that's needed is just not there. Today, collectively, if you add everything that's been spent on the transition, it's about $600 billion across the whole world. But the approximate agreement, it's about $5 trillion that is needed by 2030, which is about 10 times more that is going on today and the speed at which it is increasing. And this gap between what is needed and what's there is true for every country in the world. If you look at the chart behind me, even the richer countries, Europe has a gap, North America has a gap. But for developing countries, this gap is much more acute. Africa, or the whole region, requires 8.5 times more. South Asia requires more than 10 times more investment. And these numbers don't even capture adaptation finance. So why, if it's such a good idea, why is this not happening? And you might say that there's not enough money in the world. That is actually absolutely not true. There's more than $100 trillion in just the private capital systems in the world. So let's visit for a minute, how does transition finance happen today? There are basically four sources. Domestic investment by governments, domestic private investment, which is very important for richer countries, international finance, which is MDBs or multilateral development bank like the World Bank, or bilateral funds like US aid or British aid, and international private capital, which is the most important source for this in the future because of the biggest volume. But today what's happening is the domestic public capital, which is playing a very important role currently, is getting very squeezed. If you just look at the chart behind me carefully, you will see the country's debt burden, or the country with the highest amount of debt distress, is actually doubled since 2015. This is a vicious cycle. What's happening is countries with all kinds of climate disasters, inflation, rising interest rate, actually borrowing money to support these things, their debt costs increasing. Hence, their ability to actually invest in climate transition is that much more squeezed. As I mentioned, private capital is where the most of the resources are. And private capital actually is flowing for the transition, mostly in the richer countries. So for example, in the United States, if you wanted to build a renewable energy investment, raising money would not be a difficult thing, but it is not flowing where it's needed most, to the global south. So why is it that private capital is not flowing? There are many reasons. One of the biggest reasons is that private people who manage private capital think these investments are risky. They're riskier investment, hence they're hesitant to invest. As you can see from the numbers below, so it's the same project and will be 14 or 15% in Nigeria and Pakistan, making a project unviable. This squeeze of funds not getting to where it needs to be and countries not being able to do what they need to do for climate and development has been going on for a while. But this year, I think because of Prime Minister Mia Mottley, who's a leader from Global South, not only she complained about it, she actually came up with a comprehensive plan that got a lot of political momentum during this year. That plan had MDB reform, debt structuring from funding adaptation and loss and damage, a comprehensive plan to look at how the global financial system can work for developing countries and their needs. So the question is, will these financial reform that Mia Mottley and people like Mia Mottley is asking, will this reform take hold and spur the investment that is needed to support developing countries in the transition? Because if this reform doesn't take place, this transition will not happen. So what to watch for? How would we know this is happening? This transition won't happen in 1 year, but what can we watch for this year? One of the most important things that will happen immediately in the spring meetings of IMF and the World Bank is IMF and World Bank reform discussion has been going on for a while. The real thing to watch for is would these reforms will be incremental, meaning increasing the capacity of the institution to lend more, meaning a higher capital for them or reusing the assets they have to lend more. That would be incremental reform, but that would be important reform. Or would it be transformative, which is some leaders in the world has been calling for? A transformative reform would have two sides to it. One, it will stop and ask what are this institution should be doing in 2023 to be fit for purpose. The development agenda, why this institution was set up, has changed to a climate and development agenda. Would this institution restructure themselves to actually meet the moment. Second, we all realize, and you've seen the charts behind me, that without private capital flowing, these transformations in the countries won't take place. Would they become institutions that actually spur private sector flow? Would something that the Bridgetown Agenda has asked for IMF to use their assets differently, to create a climate mitigation trust, would that happen? Would other leaders come together to support this? There's an important summit being planned by the President of France and Mia Mottley to bring this together. Would we see this change? Would we see the global leaders of the G20, the richest 20 countries in the world, come together to support such reform of the institution? And not only that, support the overall transformation that is needed. The G20 countries themselves produce more than 75% of emissions in the world. So what they do and what they commit to do is a very important part of the architecture. India, which is now the president of G20 after Indonesia, has proposed a new disaster risk resilience working group. Would that work, which can give a real life to the need for funds for adaptation and loss and damage? Would we also see private sector, global private capital, actually rise to the moment? In the JETP, which is the agreement countries came together, few richer countries came together with Indonesia to actually transition their energy system in a just way, which asked for a $20 billion investment, unprecedented number. But it was also agreed 10 billion of that will be private capital. Would we see that happen? And finally, by the end of the year, when we all gather in November in Dubai, which is the next climate meeting, would we see a much more comprehensive discussion of the financing needs for the transition? Historically, the discussion has been focused on solidarity and justice of finance, correctly so. But would we see this go beyond whether we meet the $100 billion, which I absolutely hope we do this year, to a more comprehensive discussion of World Bank and IMDb reform, which was the first time part of the text in Egypt, and also discussion about how private capital needs to play an important role to solving the problem of transition finance? Would we see a much more comprehensive, robust discussion that can solve this problem and bring needed capital for transition global south? So the question for us, for this story, is will the reform Mia Mottley is calling for, will these reforms take hold in 2023 and start unlocking funding for the transition in developing countries? Would we see a turning point this year for how the financial architecture is serving the global south, and especially the vulnerable countries? Our next story is about U.S. climate action. Will the United States accelerate progress towards a just economic transition? Last year, the United States passed 3 historic pieces of laws. They focus on jobs. They experiment whether the world's largest economy can shift towards a low carbon and a more equitable economy. The most interesting thing about these 3 laws, however, the word climate doesn't feature in them. For good reasons. Because climate is not the only goal here. It's actually changed the whole economy towards a different kind of economy. The first of the laws is CHIPS and Science Act, which focuses on American-made technology, puts in $13 billion per year. The next one is bipartisan infrastructure law called the BILL. Invest in cleaner, accessible, and more sustainable American infrastructure. Puts $23 billion in the American economy every year. And the last one, the biggest one, IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act. It's the largest climate law in US history, puts $43 billion every year in the US economy. In addition to this, it puts $60 billion on environmental justice and health equity issues. Together, they will put 3 times more funds in the United States economy than any previous climate legislation, 3 times more. If implemented and implemented well, they have a chance of meeting Americans' carbon emission reduction goals. America's goal is to reduce 50 to 52% from 2005 levels by 2030. It'll get us to 40%. Rest of it will be done by state, business, and cities together. But more than climate, these laws is a major job creation opportunity. Just IRA and BUILD together promise to create 900,000 jobs and up to 3.1 million jobs by year 2035. Compared to that, the fossil fuel industry today in the United States together have about little more than 700,000 jobs. However, the most interesting to me, the most interesting feature, the ambition in this law, is tackling historic justice issues. Climate Justice 40 feature on this law promises to spend 40% of the benefit of climate investment for communities previously left behind or left out of climate solutions. This is a very important part of the law that focuses on making sure benefits reaches all. Of course, these goals are morally right to actually remove historical injustices that has happened through the new transition economy we're talking about. But these are also a political necessity. If people don't see, all people don't see benefits of this new economy, then we will not have the political support needed for future leaders who will produce more ambitious climate policy, because the United States and the world needs more ambitious climate policy. So the question is, will the US, implementation of all three laws, will the US be able to jumpstart a just transition to meet its climate goals while bringing economic benefit for all people? So what actions do we need to see this year to see if these goals are met? This transition will not happen in 1 year. But what needs to happen next year so that we are going in the right direction, at least we know we're going in the right direction? The first thing to watch is to make sure US will be able to accelerate renewable energy deployment, that these laws will get implemented. The many barriers towards it, one of the big barriers is permitting reform. Right now, in some cases, it takes 10 years for permitting a new project. Other countries, like Canada and Australia, have been able to tackle these challenges by reducing the permit time while not reducing environmental goals. Will the US be able to do that? Would the environmental community be a big partner supporting this reform? At the same time, would we see federal agency quickly put together regulations needed to implement these three ambitious laws? And would we see a big shift towards implementation and see projects coming across the country? Similarly, the next thing to watch is what happens at the state level. States will play a very important role in implementation of this law. So for example, if you think about California, the 5th largest global economy in the world, they have an ambitious plan for net zero by 2045. They also plan to create 4 million jobs through this process. Or Georgia, for example, which has a Republican governor, which is attracting $20 billion investment in this new economy. Each one of these states, whether it's Republican control or Democratic control, are taking these steps to attract new investment, new jobs in their states. Would we see this take place across the country, all states, by which actually rooting this transition in the economy throughout the country? The next thing to watch for is how consumers and business will react to this opportunity. The laws provide incentives or subsidies for heat pumps, solar panels, energy efficiency. If families took advantage of all of them, the estimates show each family can save $10,000 per year through this process. So imagine that. We used to think this transition to climate-friendly, low-carbon living would be actually more expensive. It turns out these laws are trying to make it beneficial for us to do so. Why? Because as more families adopt these technologies, the solutions, it creates a bigger market. It brings the prices down. It makes other people also use them. It scales the solution. Similarly, would we see businesses do the same? We already see this in the United States of investments plans being made by businesses. One of the interesting examples is a Pennsylvania company is trying to put together a $4.5 billion project in Louisiana for carbon capture. That will not only create hundreds of jobs, but bring innovation, a new solution that's needed in the system. Would we see such innovations actually proliferate across the country? The next thing to watch is whether they will be successful in their Justice 40 goals. Will government agencies follow through on the equity commitments and address historical disparities? Two examples of this: the EPA has a program for electric buses, and they plan to make sure electric bus fleets are available to every community across the world in every state. Second, the White House plans to publish a Justice 40 scorecard. I think this transparency is a very critical part to making sure we make progress, because the scale at which this Justice 40 initiative is the investment in is unprecedented. We need to learn what works and what doesn't and keep improving. Would we see this take root? The next thing to watch will be how more states develop transition programs to support workers. For example, Colorado has a plan to actually support its coal workers to new job training for the new economy. Would we see more programs like this that directly support workers take place across the country? The last thing to watch is how other countries will react to this historic legislation. Actually, we already see some trade tensions rising with America's closest partner, the EU. EU leaders have used words like protectionist, unheard of, for a long time in context of the American economy. We think such tensions actually will most probably go away. President Macron's visit recently was very helpful, and both sides, EU and the United States, have pledged to actually resolve those issues. We think something opposite actually will happen. Rather than this discussion tension, countries will try to emulate what the United States is trying to do. A large country and its elected leaders is purposefully trying to steer an economy a particular direction, a low carbon, more equal, more innovative direction. Actually, EU, in spite of the complaints on protection, is already trying to do that. They're doubling down on the EU Green Deal, which is a very similar set of legislation. Would we see other countries emulate something and put together a just and green transition for their economy? So the question for us is, this historic set of legislation in the United States, would it accelerate progress in the United States toward a just economic transition? And would this progress in the United States actually encourage others, excite other countries to put together similar legislation that starts a process of creating just transitions in those countries, not only greening the economy, but making it good, making it beneficial to everyone in those countries? Would we see a just transition across the world? Hope you enjoyed these 4 stories. Together, we think these stories will drive the direction the world is heading to. The big question is, will these remain just stories, or will they unleash systemic shifts that the world really needs? This is what WRI is all about. We on WRI try to understand what drives change. What are the systems behind the outcome we see? We try to understand them and learn how to shape them for a better outcome for the world. I really want to thank you for joining us. I really want to thank all our partners and supporters who make possible our work, make these stories possible. Thank you very much for being here.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much, all of you, for joining us. I hope you enjoyed the stories. And thank you very much for all the questions. Really appreciate your putting them on the chat. What I'm going to do is I'm going to try to group some of the questions so that we cover as many questions as we can. And we are very, very pleased. A lot of our experts have joined us. You will meet them one by one. Let me start with the first group of questions. I'm grouping them so they're not going to sound exactly as you have written them. The first question is about excitement of President Lula. The question is about what President Lula is coming in, what will be the regional impact in the region. Along with the question is question of finance. What will happen to finance of the Amazon And would we see international finance flowing to the Amazon? So it's a group of questions. I'm going to go first to Fabiola, who heads our forest work in Brazil. I request Fabiola and all of you, all my experts, to please introduce yourself before responding. Fabiola, over to you.
Thanks, Annie. Well, I'm Fabiola Zerbini. I'm Director for Forest, Land Use and Agriculture here in Brazil, WRI Brazil. And I think that first, we have a great opportunity to really strain a governmental cooperation, public-private, but mainly governmental cooperation, mainly pushed by the Amazon. There's no way to combat illegal deforestation or build a bioeconomy for the Amazon without a regional approach, a shared vision, and a common action plan. And going beyond the Amazon, we have other very important biomes in the region for carbon sink, biodiversity protection, equity, or even global food security. So the Cerrado, Chaco, Orinoco should be protected while keep producing food to the world. So a real agriculture transition, 2023 can be the year that we will start and reinforce towards a produce, protect, reduce, and restore model.
Thank you, Fabiola. If I can bring Francis here. Francis Seymour is a global expert on forest topic. And Francis, a question on financing and how does it impact the work that you've recently done in the Brazilian forest. Can you share with us in the question of how forests impact the economy?
Sure. Well, I think, Ani, in your remarks, it was implicit, if not explicit, that we need to complement our focus on the problem of deforestation from a global climate perspective to one of a local economic perspective. And that implies what kind of finance is appropriate for protecting forests. There's a growing body of research that WRI has contributed a policy analysis of about how forests affect the climate in ways other than through the global carbon cycle. For example, evapotranspiration that generates rainfall, as well as maintaining local cooler temperatures. And those impacts are actually of similar magnitude and more immediate effect on local communities and economies than the effects mediated through the greenhouse effect globally. And there are immediate impacts on agriculture in reducing productivity due to lengthened droughts and increased temperatures, and also on workers, local communities who are enduring extreme heat stress. And so an investment in protecting forests is actually an investment in protecting local food security, local worker safety, and other things that are important locally to resilience. But it also matters who manages these forests. And we've known for a long time that indigenous territories, for example, are more associated with maintaining forest cover. But we have some new calculations showing that those parts of the Amazon that have remained carbon sinks are those managed by indigenous peoples. And it's those areas outside those lands that are the ones that are becoming carbon emission sources. And so an investment in strengthening the rights of indigenous peoples and their local economies is an investment in global climate stability. So I think that shift in perspective from the local to the global in terms of impacts as well as who's managing makes a lot of difference in how we think about these things.
Thank you very much, Francis, to bring the broader perspective. Craig, if I can bring you in. Craig is a managing director for Program. Craig, the question to remind you was the potential or possibility of international finance flowing to Amazon given President Lula's election.
Yeah, I think this is an interesting window of a moment of opportunity here that, when Lula was in Sharm, as you said, it really was the hot ticket to be at, right? It gave rock and roll bands a run for their money. And I think the question for us, WRI and the rest of our community is, how do we leverage the next 6 to 8 months to actually take advantage of that, right? He faces a lot of, he did not win, his party did not win the Congress, right? So he's going to need to be able to show quickly and early that this promise of reversing the deforestation actually is in the economic and political interest of Brazilians. And so it's incumbent upon the international community to be there to shake that extended hand. And so private finance, development banks, nation states that are interested in helping to conserve the Amazon, that's really, we have to make sure that people move quickly to actually help and have those answers for them, because this is a unique window. And also what you mentioned is he reached out his hand across 2 other basins. We've never seen that before, I would argue, in the history of the world, right? So how are we going to leverage the chance for across 3 basins to get that political attention that hasn't been there, that's fundamentally needed across, basically getting going over the next 6 to 8 months, so that when it comes time for the UAE COP, there's some progress to show.
Thank you very much, Craig. And if we have time, Francis, I'm going to bring you back on the possibility of carbon market, which has been discussed, but let me go to other question. There's an excellent question on energy transition. Jennifer, if I can bring you in. Jennifer leads our energy group globally. And I'm going to read this question. It's actually well crafted. So I don't know if you've seen this, Jennifer, yet. So it says, do you think on balance, the Russian invasion of Ukraine has driven more fossil fuel investment or green energy investment in near term or in the long term?
Thanks for the question. And as we noted in the story, it is actually, we're at a juncture. We're at a point where investment in both renewables and in new fossil gas infrastructure are happening simultaneously. I think the thing we'll watch is whether the new pipelines for these projects continues to grow as fast as it has in this past year, because we need to ensure that the pipeline of projects is actually reflecting the longer term goals, the longer term vision, and whether that infrastructure is perceived to be at risk. So new development and exploration of natural gas, net new, is inconsistent with our climate goals of 1.5 degrees. And yet we know that there have been important opportunities in the short term to help bridge the energy crisis by undertaking expansions in natural gas. Long term, however, we continue to believe that renewable energy and hydrogen and other new technologies are likely to have the better economic returns.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. Stinja, I just want to extend the same question to you. Stinja is our head of our Europe works and based in Europe. She's in the middle of all this discussion. She used to be part of the Dutch government before. So Stinja, how would you respond to the same question? Is it driving this disruption more investment in renewable or in non-fossil related investment in the short or the long term?
Well, I think that what we're currently seeing is that the International Energy Agency actually projected an outlook that says that 90% of expansion in energy capacity is likely to be in renewables over the next 5 years. So while these are plans, let's say that would point towards a shift and to a possibility of this being an opportunity. Of course, like Jennifer said, we need to see how this pans out. But I do see that there's a real opportunity for this to be a speeding up, not just in Europe, but potentially indeed globally.
I like your optimism, Stinja. Thank you very much. There is a really good question on finance. Shuang, if I can bring you in. Shuang leads our finance work globally. And Shuang, this is a question we tried to address actually in the story, is that, the question is about, can we bring Shuang in? Thank you. The question is about, how do we reconcile this fundamental contradiction in the global financial system? Climate proofing finance led by World Bank and ADB actually, makes the countries more dependent on loans and to undermine the cause of mitigation and adaptation. So this conundrum, the cyclical nature of this, how do we break out of it? If you remember, Shuang, in our story, we talked about how concessional capital over the same years has not increased to these countries. Shuang, over to you.
Thanks, Annie. This is a brilliant question. That's exactly what we are arguing for in the broader global financial system reform. We need to address some of those fundamental questions. As a matter of fact, the many multilateral development banks, MDBs, as well as the other international financial institutions have in the past have tools mostly from the economic and financial perspectives to actually do a health check with the recipient countries of the money. What we see a very important opportunity is how the MDBs and IFIs can mainstream climate and other environmental and development goals into the existing tools that these MDBs and IFIs have. Two examples we can quickly share is that, for instance, IMF has had this surveillance on an annual basis to do an annual economic health check with their member countries. And by mainstreaming the climate and other environmental concerns in this process, this can help to encourage IMF's member countries to do more on climate and environmental goals. And the other MDBs for a long time have the policy-based lending or the other format of policy-based financing. Again, by mainstreaming the climate and environmental development goals in there, that will give MDBs another opportunity to encourage the recipient countries for the political reform and political policy action that's really fully aligned with the climate and other development goals.
Thank you very much, Wang. If I have time, I want to come back to what else needs to happen besides the World Bank. There's a question in the US, Dan, if I can bring you in. Dan leads our work in the United States. Dan, the question is, I'm going to read the question. Is the action the United States is taking to advance just transition to meet climate goals ambitious enough? Or do we need more radical change from such high-emitting nations? So it's talk about the United States goals. It's a very good question, Dan.
Sure. Well, the short answer is no, it's not ambitious enough. But after decades of failure, near misses, and incremental steps, we now, for the first time, have national legislation that at least puts us in the right ballpark. As we showed in the story, we think that, and a lot of independent modeling shows that with the Inflation Reduction Act and the other laws that have passed at the national level, we can get to about a 40% reduction by 2030. That's not our national commitment, which is to a 50 to 52%. So we need to build on that. There are several important ways we can build on that. One, actually, in the federal government, are regulations that can be put in place by the Environmental Protection Agency and the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. Those will be important to accelerate investment and to accelerate retirement of dirty fossil fuels. We can't just build clean stuff and leave the dirty electricity sources and other things in place. So that's important. But then, as Ani mentioned in the story, other action by states, local governments, businesses will really be important to get us fully on track to where we need to go.
Dan, I'm going to have you here. Let me just ask another question that's just come up. Is on trade. And this is, in my story, I mentioned how the 3 US laws have raised question of trade, especially for you and others. So the question is more general. Will trade enhance or hurt this transition? You can talk about the US case. I'm going to bring others in, Stinge and others in the story, in this answer.
Yeah, this is a really good question and one that we're really trying to dig into, because I think there's two effects at the same time. One is, in order to have the political support to make this transition, it has to create good jobs in each country that is investing. So the provisions in the Inflation Reduction Act to Buy American, to actually support prevailing wages. So to get the full tax credits, in most cases, you have to pay prevailing wages, which is a way to help support unions. That's really important to build and sustain political support and to make sure that everybody sees the benefits of these laws. At the same time, if we move into a protectionist, more protectionist regime, it's going to raise the cost of making the transition. On net, I think that the effects of the Inflation Reduction Act are going to be positive, that other countries are appearing to respond rather than by raising tariffs, but by making similar investments in their own industrial policy. So overall, I think it is positive, but we do have to be careful not to go too far in a protectionist direction.
But your point about other countries investing in similar ways, we're already seeing some of that in Europe that we talked about in the story. Let me bring Stinge in. Thank you very much, Dan. Stinge, if I can bring you in, same question, because the trade has been an issue before the US policies actually in Europe already had a set of a trade-related policy on CBAM. So Stinge, I would love to hear your views on that.
Yeah, it's a great question, because actually there's two ways in which governments also can look at trade. You can either look at trade from a greening supply chains perspective, because we all know that procurement, whether that is private or public procurement, plays an incredible role in creating markets for different economies. And a good example is Europe with their new regulation on deforestation-free supply chains, actually really creating a market for other countries to start producing in a way that protects climate, nature, and is good for people. Of course, the design of such regulation is then really critical to ensure that it does really maintain market access for those countries, and that we help build the capacities also in those countries to be able to export to Europe. The second category indeed is the one that could lead to either a stimulation of innovation in your domestic markets, but could also result in a protection of that domestic market. So whether you're talking about CBAM, whether you're talking about IRA or the Ursula von der Leyen response that was recently announced, it will be very much in the design we will see the balance between a protectionism of your local industries, actually might even slow them down to the pace that they would have in a competitive market, or it will enable them to actually create that extra step, to go that extra mile, because they have that shelter. And so it's really in the design of these sticks and carrots that defines their effectiveness. So fully agree with Dan on that point.
Stinja, you use CBAM. Just for our audience, can you just say one sentence what CBAM is?
Yes, of course, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which is basically meant to say if you produce green steel, for example, in Europe, using hydrogen, which will elevate the costs, and somebody else produces in a very carbon intensive way, then you will get a border tax that equalizes that difference related to the carbon intensity of the production processes outside of Europe to enable to green production processes in Europe, thereby speeding up the general transition and driving down the cost of new technologies and innovations. If you design it that way, and if you design that fair, then it can be a good thing. If it becomes just protectionism, then it can actually hamper trade, but also the development towards sustainability.
And it's a very different way to approach greening the economy, for example, to create a
governments can do regulation or can steer with financing mechanisms, but these are basically two different ways to do the same, and should also be designed with the same elements in mind, ensure that it stimulates innovation but doesn't create unnecessary protection, because that could then actually slow down.
I think that is the challenge. Let's just, if I can bring Jennifer you in, because trade has been such an important discussion since the invasion of Ukraine, simply because how fossil fuel actually has been. Just want to bring you in at the same question of how trade can enhance or hinder the just transition.
Yeah, well, certainly in energy, we've seen a whole lot of supply chain disruptions in this past few years, whether that was from COVID or from the natural, the fossil gas issues associated with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But just to hammer home the point, this can be both a driver and an inhibitor on the opportunities for things like battery manufacturing, solar PV, other supply chain opportunities. Clean energy technologies and the opportunity for governments to support clean energy technology development and manufacturing in there is a part of a more diversified economy. This is not just about where you get your fuel, it's about how you structure your economy. Look at what India has done, for example, in thinking about building out electric mobility as a core part of what they can do, both for air quality and for development of new industries that would both create lower carbon and better air quality. Electric mobility requires that they invest in battery technology, consideration associated with green hydrogen, thinking about those opportunities for their economy. Trade, however, is an essential part of the supply chains for all of these new technology opportunities. But diversification away from a single supplier is likely to be the most critical thing that we're going to see in this next 5 to 10 years.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. And I think this is a very important question of trade. I want to bring in another question that has come in. Fabiola, I'm going to go to you next because trade is a very important part of the Amazon story. But the next question is actually could be a whole seminar we could do. And it's a really good question. The question is it possible to have just transition, both at the national and international level simultaneously? Like if you think about what we're talking about trade, it's asking the same question of creating jobs. So Fabiola, going back to you first, just think about this question about how trade can impact or hinder the just transition or protection of the Amazon forest? And Frances, I'm going to come to you after that. Fabiola, please.
Thanks, Annie. I think first, this is a global issue. You know, like when you have Brazil as a producer country and other countries as demand side countries, you know, this is not only an issue from one or the other. So public procurements like zero deforestation, due diligence are very important, but they are not enough. We have a very important issue to build the transition. The agricultural transition costs time, resources, and political willingness. So, and this is, again, a global responsibility. So I think that Article 28, for instance, which is about the produce partnerships, you know, so how to build collectively the agricultural transition is as important as the due diligence rules or mechanisms that we have. So trade can help, yes, but we need to together build the transition to really have an impact that is in favor now with our goals here.
I mean, that's a very important point, Fabiola. I mean, we have seen in the story, we talked about how EU already has deforestation laws that impacts the commodity trading, but we also pointed out that a lot of the deforestation, not all of it, in the Amazon basin is connected with commodities that are exported. So the trade has a real impact, both positive at this point, also negative. Leather, for example, people have pointed out is a very bad. No, so I like this connection. Frances, if I can bring you in, just building on this question, Frances, there's been so much discussion of the potential, let's put it positive way, potential of the global carbon market. So if you think about trade, this is another question, right? A flow of capital from global north to global south and vice versa. What's your, was a very big topic at COP, it was a very big topic recently at Davos. What is your view of this year coming forward on trade? And
well, I think 2023 is shaping up to be a real inflection point for global carbon markets in general and for markets for forest carbon in particular. And I think there's a consensus at WRI, at least, that as long as carbon markets serve to increase climate ambition, for example, by corporate buyers purchasing credits above and beyond their science-based own abatement in order to counterbalance unabated emissions on the pathway to net zero. And as long as carbon finance does result in emissions reductions or removals of high integrity, as well as making the funds making their way to indigenous and local communities to improve local rights and livelihoods, then this can certainly be part of a just transition. And we had seen a rapid increase in 2021 in participation, transactions, and value in the carbon market, with a large share of that being for forest carbon. But then that leveled off in 2022, in part because there was a sense of uncertainty on the part of corporations about, I think, on the one hand, the environmental and social integrity of credits, but also on whether they as companies were going to be able to make any claims against those purchases. And at the same time, as has been in the press lately, there's been some concern about the environmental and social integrity of forest carbon credits. And many of the international initiatives that have been put into place to actually set up the guardrails for, on the one hand, what companies can claim based on purchases, and on the other hand, to make sure that credits that are transacted are a very high level of quality, are expected to report out in the coming months. So this 2023 is going to be the year, I think, about whether we can, in fact, get it right to liberate the very, very much urgently needed billions of dollars of finance to incentivize governments to do what only governments can do in protecting forests and other climate action. But can we do it in a way that enhances overall ambition and also results in equitable benefit sharing to those on the ground?
so Frances, you, us, a lot of other organizations like us had, as you correctly pointed out, predicted a exponential growth of the carbon market, right, last year. And as you pointed out, that didn't happen. Really, we are all surprised that didn't happen. And you see 2023 as a different year, that predictability on the market that the private sector was waiting for. You think that taking place this year?
I certainly hope so, because the other side of that equation is that we are just now at an inflection point on the supply side, where after 15 years of investment in REDD+, the framework for reducing, forest emissions under the climate agreement, is beginning to show results. And you mentioned Indonesia as having, done a great job in reducing forest emissions over the last 5 years. Just last month, Guyana became the first tropical forest country to do a major jurisdictional scale issuance of forest-based emission reductions. And it would be unfortunate if after all of these years of countries putting into place their forest monitoring capacity, which WRI has certainly been working with many countries on, and are actually starting to show performance in reducing emissions, the finance to reward that performance needs to be in place. And so 2023 is the year that we try to build that confidence, both on the buyer side and the supplier side, that those transactions can take place.
Thank you, Frances. And just want to point to all our viewers who have joined it. The Guyana example is actually an excellent one. If you have a chance, please look into that particular example. We think that can set the trend. To wrap up these questions on trade, Dan, if I can bring you in briefly, I really do want you to address the question that is it possible to have just transition both locally and globally at the same time? I hope your answer is yes. If not, say something else. No, Dan, over to you. It's a very, very good question.
It's an excellent question, and a challenging one. But I think really there's a lot of similarity between ensuring a just transition within countries. So that means making sure that the communities that have been left out of economic development and environmental progress in the past are brought fully in, and that we're redressing those inequities with justice programs like the Justice 40 program. At the same time, similarly, we need to make sure that countries that have suffered from colonialism and other types of exploitation are part of the global transition. For the US in particular, we're right now doing, frankly, a better job internally than we are externally. One of the big gaps that we identify with US climate policy is that the US is way behind in meeting its climate finance goals. So that's a priority for us to try to get the administration to lean more heavily into meeting the targets and mobilizing the climate finance that President Biden has pledged, so that we get that global solidarity as well as internal solidarity.
And we pointed out, Dan, in our story, how that solidarity in finance will be a very big thing to watch this year, both throughout the year, actually, and with the divided Congress, that U.S. pledge is slightly riskier than it was even a few months back. So it's a very important topic to watch for. Thank you very much, Dan. Craig, if I can bring you in, there's an excellent question that is very much up your own research work. And I'm going to read out the question. It's actually very well crafted. The question is called Elephant in the Room. It's not about elephants, though. It's about cattle. And so the question is, we all know that a lot of deforestation due to cattle for their pastures to grow the food, etc. When will human diet and climate change start to be addressed? This connection with human diet. And other than economics, are cows necessary? Why are we ignoring diet? This is a transition question, actually very connected to the Amazon question we were discussing. There's another question connected to it. Maybe you can address both of them together. Is a question of something you have worked on a lot about, the regard of protein, transition of protein from animal to plants and plant-based. How do you see that future? Craig, over to you.
Great, thanks. And thanks for the question. The protein shift was actually a story to watch maybe 2 years ago or so, when we started seeing the rise of alt proteins like Impossible Burgers and things like that. So the fact it didn't show up in Ani's position today doesn't mean that we don't think it's an issue. We touched upon it 2 years ago. It's quite interesting. Yes, our analysis finds that a protein shift is needed, looking from just at least from a climate perspective and land use perspective. Ruminant meat, meat from cows in particular, and dairy have the largest land footprint as well as the largest GHG footprint per kilogram or gram of protein on the planet. And if the entire world ate the amount of ruminant meat, high carbon foods like Americans do, there just wouldn't be enough land, and the amount of GHG emissions that actually would be huge. In fact, about half of all the direct emissions from the agricultural sector, from the direct emissions of agriculture, are related to ruminant animals. So the methane in particular. And so, yes, all major climate scenarios that the IPCC put out actually shows some type of a shift, not the elimination, but a shift, right? A bending of the curve in terms of ruminant meat consumption. There's both a demand and a supply issue to this, though. One thing, you actually have to ensure that there's a supply of lower carbon dishes, and that's from getting what restaurants serve to what people develop and make in their home of delicious and nutritious, plant-based options, or at least lower on the food chain options of meat. At the same time, there's a rise in alternative protein, and that's probably gets most of the news nowadays is the Impossible Foods, and now they're trying to make actual real meat, but from the cell cultures of animals and have it in big vats, and basically you'll still get real meat, but not coming from an actual cow, but from a lab. That stuff's a little bit, there's a lot of investment in the latter. Keep your eye on that to see whether it develops or not. The costs are really high, but you already do have the alternative proteins, the Impossible Burgers, Beyond Meat, et cetera. And now they're looking at making alternatives for chicken, et cetera. So keep an eye on that. Actually, growth the past year is actually stagnated. So there's a big question to keep your eye out for. Is this a temporary blip, or has it hit some type of an already ceiling already? And there's a lot of stories right now about this. And so we're keeping our eye on what's going to happen to the market there. That's the supply side. But you also have the demand. Consumers need to want these things. So therefore, that's why we need to keep our eye on, are the alternative options, do they taste like, do they provide the same taste benefits as well as socioeconomic status desires people have in terms of the diets that they actually have. We actually do some innovative work with the private sector through the Cool Food program. We're getting a lot of companies now who actually serve food to people in Europe and the United States to actually set science-based targets for the food they actually offer, and they're actually lowering the GHG intensity of the foods they're serving, which for a lot of it means offering more and promoting more plant-based dishes, as well as just lowering the amount of beef and or milk dairy products that are being offered. And consumers are going for it because their sales are still high. Consumers are moving in that direction. So it definitely is a trend that needs to happen and a trend to watch.
I just want to add one of the things I learned actually through this process of success that Craig talked about is I did not know this. IKEA happens to be the biggest meatball seller in the world. I don't know if you knew this. And they have had real success, exactly what Craig, with the experimentation and invention of alternative protein in meatballs, and their sales have actually steadily increased. So that's a really good, positive story across the world, because this point Craig was making about cultural difference and cultural shift. So we have more stories. Craig, just the last part of this question, because you've talked about behavior, and we at WRI putting a lot of emphasis on behavioral science and how choices will change. The question on this, on the protein transition, is about leadership. So how do you see, is it companies, that was the question, leading, or you think governments are leading? How do you see that leadership question, the protein transition, which all of us agree that it's a difficult transition?
Yes, I see in terms of stories to watch, I see companies leading on the demand side, and I see companies and governments playing some role on the supply side. And what I mean by that is, on the demand side, you have these cool food companies that are actually engaging, creating offers that consumers want, which is not just the dish itself, it's also the language they use. Part of our behavioral lab research finds that even how you describe products on a menu influences how people actually buy, or even where you place it. Right, putting foods in the vegetarian box actually decreases the amount that actually consumers actually buy the product. If you actually list all your products in the same list, including the non-meat option amongst everything else, actually sales go up, right? Because people self-select. If I'm not a vegetarian, I'm not going to look at that box. So all of a sudden, those options don't even become a person's choice. On the supply side, we're seeing a lot of innovation. There's a lot of private sector and venture capital going into these alternative protein companies, but governments have a role too. And this is through investments in some of the basic research, so that the companies that are trying to develop these alternative proteins aren't all just aren't just competing against each other. There's actually some shared research and knowledge. Just like in the energy industry, there was a lot of pre-competitive shared research and knowledge that was developed. The same is needed, and we're starting to see when it comes to governments and their role to play to help strengthen that market.
This is very much a story to watch for. Maybe we'll develop this further, Craig, in our next year. I mean, I think companies are doing a lot. I don't see enough, I think, governments saying, this is a shift we need. And because it's kind of a tricky space for a lot of governments to talk about.
It's tricky. Governments are afraid to get into the pantries of people's homes, right? And that's a tricky one, right? But President Xi in China last year announced that he's telling his government to actually increase its investment in alternative proteins, especially these manufactured proteins, for the sake of food security and shortening supply chains. So keep your eye out on that.
So that's a really good example to end the section with. I want to go, thank you very much, Craig. I want to bring Shuang back in. Shuang leads our work on finance globally. Shuang, the question is on loss and damage. Can we bring Shuang in? Thank you. So the question was the modalities for accessing the loss and damage fund are not yet there. What can stakeholders do in advance of the Dubai meeting to reach a good outcome? And before Shuang, you come in, I just want to point out, I think the loss and damage fund, as I mentioned the story, is really a symbol of solidarity between more developed, richer countries and vulnerable and poorer countries. It has much more symbolic value at this point. And I just want to point out two other things need to happen at the next COP, in addition to loss and damage progress. I mean, they're not supposed to finish this by now. Shuang will come in a minute, but also the doubling of adaptation finance that was promised. And finally, there was a pledge in 2009 that by 2020, there'll be $100 billion of climate finance available to a poor country. That pledge was not yet met. The hope is by next year, end of this year, that pledge of 100 billion. So I think there's a package of financial pledges that will strengthen the progress and solidarity that was made at the last COP in Egypt. Shuang, on loss and damage.
Thanks, Danny. And actually, to echo your point, I think one of the most important things we need to watch for is that how the loss and damage financing will be additional to the mitigation and adaptation finance. So I will think of three things that would determine how effective and the loss and damage financing can run. Firstly, it is still not clear on which other countries or the other financing sources will contribute to this loss and damage fund, and how this will be, again, additional to the 100 billion goals and even more ambitious goals that the developed countries will commit to in the coming years. So who will contribute to the loss and damage financing? The second part, I think at DBRI and our partners have done a lot of research to look into, is that how we can clearly define what are the activities that are eligible to receive funding from such a loss and damage fund. It's not the easiest thing to define like what kind of activities, and also considering the other humanitarian and the other climate related activities. So what kind of methodologies and a systematic way that all the stakeholders agree on under a loss and damage funding will be very essential. The third point is that how a loss and damage funding will run, because many of the existing multilateral climate and environmental funds we have seen can actually largely improve their efficiency in channeling the funding, and also be more nimble in responding to the request of the recipient countries. And the loss and damage fund can probably build on the existing experiences and including lessons learned from the other multilateral climate funds, so that they can channel the funding to where the fund is needed most urgently.
If I can quickly, because we're going to run out of time, Shuang, there was a lot of discussion about definitions here of what is loss and what is adaptation, setting up the adaptation goal for this year. Can you just say a couple of sentences quickly, because I have one more question to go to, about the progress you think is being made or will be made on these definitional issues?
Yeah, there will be several sessions between now and COP28 to clearly spell out some of the technical definitions on it. And WRI's team is actually very much closely following these sessions and trying to provide technical advices what we can use to fit in.
Thank you, and do watch for. I think there needs to be and will be a lot of progress in this area. I have just time for one more question, and the last question is actually really a brilliant one. I'm going to bring Craig and Dan in. Craig first. The question is actually about relation to mobilization youth. Can we bring Craig in? Thank you very much, and Dan. Mobilization of youth movement, building on grassroots to shift behaviors in useful way, from bottom up way, in food production, basic economic activities, creation of jobs. The question is, how can youth be involved not only in creating the demand, but also getting benefit from this movement? Craig, if I can go to you first with our big announcement at COP on AFR 100 and how that mobilized, and then Dan, I'll close with you on what's happening in the United States. Craig, over to you.
Yes. So as some of you may know, WRI works with the African Union to convene something like the AFR 100, the Africa Forest Restoration Initiative 100, looking to restore more than 100 million hectares of degraded areas in Africa by the year 2030. We recently won a large grant from the Bezos Earth Fund to really scale up that work, and there's more funding coming in to actually help support Africa in doing that restoration. A lot of restoration in Africa is on smaller scale areas, distributed across the landscape in local communities. And the only way we're going to get there is actually engaging those communities, especially the youth, in doing the restoration. And what we're seeing is the promise and the hope, and already some traction on the ground of the youth that live in villages, but also young entrepreneurs who are developing innovative businesses that actually get the saplings, raise the saplings, get them in the ground, and create innovative business models where kind of a restoration economy that's involving local youth. Which is super important, not only for the youth themselves, but also for the nation state who's trying to figure out how do I create jobs in the rural economy, because there's so much migration into the urban economy. And so what we're seeing is that the restoration agenda is one that can be very powerful to helping create those local jobs in rural areas for the next generation.
And the key here is that restoration and the scale that Craig just talked about, more than 100 million hectares across 30 countries, is hyper-local. It's hyper-local. So how do you actually get communities, entrepreneurs mobilized and get the technical assistance funding that they need for the movement is a critical. Dan, you have a very great honor to bring us to a close. The question is youth involvement in the movement of transition in the United States, especially what the administration focused on Justice 40, what you're doing in the electric bus movement, if you can share some thoughts on that.
Yeah, the youth climate movement's been absolutely essential to make climate change one of the top agenda items. In 2018, youth movement actually sat in the office of House Speaker Nancy Pelosi when she first became Speaker after the Democrats took control of the House. I think if they hadn't done that, we would not have seen the progress we've seen in the last 2 years. And going forward, you mentioned electric school buses. We really want to see children get the benefits of climate action and grow up recognizing that things like electric school buses, but also green schoolyards and solar and electrified schools is the future, and that they get that from the very beginning, so that the next generation just expects clean energy to be how we power the world. I think that's critical.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you very much. If I can ask whoever is managing this to bring all our experts on screen, I really want to thank all of you from all over the world who have joined this, and for the absolute brilliant questions all of you have asked. I'm trying to get everyone. Can you see everyone? Yeah, you can. And I hope we did justice to your question. Thank you for your engagement. We absolutely want, we can't do this without the whole community participating. I hope this whole discussion and recording will be available on the website that you can come back to and ask questions from. And thank you very much. Thanks to all our experts, and thank you everyone for joining. Have a great day and come back for the next Stories to Watch.